Okay, so let's continue with the sixth panel, titled Electoral Fraud, Electoral Violence, and Authoritarian Regimes versus Electoral Integrity in Latin America. We have, for this panel, we have Professor Salvador Romero, Professor Benigno Alarcón, Professor Carlos Ponce, and to chair, Professor Frank Garcia. I want to introduce you to Professor Frank Garcia. He is faculty in Boston College Law School since 2001, where he teaches international law and international investment law. So thank you, Professor Garcia, to join us today. And here you have.
Huh?
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming. Let me just briefly introduce the panelists before we start, and also give my apologies in advance for only coming today and then leaving after the panel. I teach Thursdays and Fridays, and we have a reunion going on at the law school, so it's a bit of a busy couple days. We're in the order in which they'll be speaking. First, we'll be hearing from Carlos Ponce, who is the Regional Director and the Latin American and Caribbean Senior Fellow at the Freedom House, where he works on the development and management of a number of democracy, rule of law, governance, and human rights projects throughout the region. He has over 25 years of experience working in the areas of governance, rule of law, civil society development, human rights, and democracy throughout the U.S., Latin America, and the Caribbean, and has worked on electoral issues in a number of countries throughout the area. As the former president of the Latin American and Caribbean Network for Democracy, he coordinated a regional network of 430 organizations, which seems like a political success in itself to coordinate that many groups. And he also lectures at Northeastern University here in town. Second will be Salvador Romero, who has his PhD in political science from Sciences Po. And in addition to his work as a professor in Bolivia, Dr. Romero has been the vice president and president of the electoral management body of Bolivia, the Corte Nacional, and vice president of the electoral management body of La Paz. In addition to publishing a number of books and articles in various venues throughout Latin America and Europe, he has participated in electoral or political missions in almost 20 countries in Africa and the Americas, including most recently the Colombian peace process and Mexico. Third, we'll be hearing from Benigno Alarcón, who is the founder and director of the Center for Political Studies at La Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Venezuela. He also serves as president of the Foundation for Development Organizations of the Americas, which is a nonprofit working for democratization in Venezuela. Recently, his focus has been on democracy activism and the education of political and civic society leadership. He's been a lawyer and advisor for the Venezuelan Congress and the executive branch, professor of undergraduate and graduate programs at several universities, and was part of the campaign team for civil society in the 2006 Venezuelan election. So we have a group of experts very well qualified to address these themes, and without further delay, hand it over to Carlos Ponce.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. For me, it's an honor to be here, and more with the extraordinary presentation that I heard yesterday and today. Maybe I'm gonna be different because even though I have been participating in some electoral observation missions and I have been participating in some elections in some countries, over the time I have been thinking through the third way and the second way and whatever we have right now. And what I have been thinking is that unless we invest in institutions, in governance, and improve rule of law in the countries, even though that you wanted to invest in electoral process, improve electoral observation, improve the electoral authorities, that is worthless. That you're not gonna advance at the end of the day. The cycle will return. And it's that one of the role of Freedom House, it's evaluating democracies and the health of democracy. We evaluate the freedom in the world, that we evaluate the elections, but also governance. We try to figure out how democracy is working and how rule of law is working in all the countries. And we also have freedom of the press, that we have like freedom of speech, freedom of, we also have freedom of the internet, freedom in the net. And we evaluate all of this. Of course, normally it's post-mortem. What we evaluate is what happened the year before, and then we publish our report. But in our report, and when you compare our report with the criminality index, for example, or when you try to also compare our report with Transparency International corruption perception, you always see the same countries all over. It's the same countries. When you evaluate which country is the best country in Latin America in terms of democracy, it's always Costa Rica, or it's always Chile, it's always Uruguay. When you evaluate the criminality index and the governance of every country, it's always the three countries, the ones that perform better because they have a stronger institution, they have the better judiciary, they have rule of law. And anti-corruption the same. So it's about the countries with stronger democracies because they have better institutions. And the bad countries are always the same bad countries. We have been investing millions of dollars in improving electoral observation, improving electoral authorities, bringing new technologies to these countries, and the result is always the same. There are problems with the election in each country. There are problems in terms of the perception of corruption in each one of these countries. And that's another problem, that at the end of the day, when you arrive to the country, it's already lost. We hear about Honduras. Yes, we hear about Honduras. Then when they organized the election in Honduras, it was a fraudulent election per se, because the constitution in Honduras prohibited the re-election. And even though the Supreme Court interpreted that maybe there's a possibility that you can have an election in Honduras, there was never a possibility of an election in Honduras. But the day that we had electoral observation in Honduras, and we begin to evaluate the situation in Honduras, there was a fraudulent election per se. Same happened in Nicaragua. Evaluating an election in Nicaragua, sending electoral observers to Nicaragua, evaluating the system in Nicaragua, that doesn't make sense. Evaluating the election I saw yesterday, evaluating the election also in Venezuela. Let's evaluate the elections in Venezuela in the last 10 years. The last election in Venezuela was not constitutional. The constitution was not taken into account for the election. The opposition did not participate except a candidate who was part of the government, and there was a fraudulent election. So what are you going to evaluate there? If you don't change the institutions, you're not going to get anything else from this. So it is always the countries with less institutional support, the countries without rule of law, that you have the same result all over all the time. So it's a waste of money. You improve the electoral authority, you invest in electoral voting, you invest in whatever you want, but if you don't have an authority, a rule of law, a court who can also solve the conflict internally, you're going to have always problems in all of these countries. And you can go over, and this is also, you can compare our Freedom of the World 2018 with the electoral integrity, and you're going to see the same countries again. It's always the same countries. And you can continue doing that. The State of Liberty from Freedom House, there's a State of Liberty. And you compare that with the Electoral also. You're going to see it's always the same. Same countries, same problems. It's because of lack of institution, lack of capabilities to solve the conflict, lack of investment in rule of law, lack of the possibilities of having a governance that can allow people to have a decent election in those countries. And then, of course, it is always about institutions. If you don't have governance, you don't have a possibility of improving the situation in country, which means you're going to have more poverty. It's always the same country. Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and then the bad cases, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, Paraguay. It's always the same cases. It's always the same cases, whatever you want to do. Violence and rule of law and government. Violence, more violent, the countries without a rule of law. Less violence, the countries with better rule of law. It's always the same. So, what you get from all these index? First, my concern with all the index, including Freedom House Index, we base our index in perceptions. There are better index, some index better than others, but sometimes we base what we see in how we perceive what happened there. As I say, in Honduras, the perception that everything is terrible. Of course, because the election was rigged from day one. It is better than Honduras than Venezuela? No. Is worse Honduras than Venezuela? No. And sometimes you have the perception that make you some bias in terms of what you measure. The second problem that I have with all the index is the categories. When you evaluate democracy as electoral democracies, you have a problem in what you are evaluating. You begin to create terms of competitive authoritarianism, imperfect democracy, electoral autocracies, hybrid regimes, because your base is wrong. You're evaluating democracies in terms of the capability of these countries to organize election. If the election is good, you have imperfect democracies. Even though you are in a dictatorship, like in Venezuela, or like in Nicaragua, or like in Cuba. So you have dictatorships, and for many years, it took a lot of time, a lot of killings in those countries, in Nicaragua or in Venezuela, to people to begin to admit, oh, maybe those are dictatorships. There's not imperfect democracy or the competitive authoritarianism. And you're wasting your time doing that kind of evaluations over the time. As you can see, as I have been telling you, there's a few groups of countries that really you have a rule of law, institutions. They are the countries that perform in any election in the same countries all over. Then a second group with kind of some institutionality that perform better than the other, but you still have violence, you still have some problems, because at the end of the day, you don't have the full capability of the state to solve the conflict, to reduce the violence. Those are countries that are more stable than others. And then you have the last group, that's open dictatorship. What I don't think that until you get rid of the dictatorship, you can have any decent election in those countries. And I don't believe that organizing election all over and over in these dictatorships is going to make any change. Because it's a process. You have, in any country, if you have a revolution, a change in the country, then suddenly you have the possibility of change. Venezuela, you have the possibility of change. And you don't change the structure, you don't change the elite, you don't create institutions, you don't create a stability in those countries, you're not going to get a consolidated democracy. We always hear, let's improve the electoral authorities, let's improve whatever is there, let's create some elections, but we're going to continue the cycle alone. Because we never consolidate, but we need to consolidate. We need to consolidate strong democracy. We invest in a strong democracy. We change that, and we're going to have better elections in those countries automatically improving the capability of those societies to have institutions, to have stable institutions. Then you're going to have a consolidated democracy. The rest is investing in something that's going to be worthless. Okay. So you can prove that right now with the election in Brazil. The election in Brazil was perfect. But what happened? They made a mistake electing Bolsonaro? No, it's what they wanted. They were angry about the system. They decided to vote whoever fight against the system and offer to destroy the system, you're willing to vote for him. What happened later is that you're going to have the same problems in Venezuela. And even with the best electoral system, you're going to have that all over. So the risk here is continue this cycle. And instead of the third way, we're going to talk about the fourth way, the fifth way, because isolated reforms without institutional reform all over is not going to work. More in countries with fragile political parties. So you have a good system, but you don't have a political party. So even if the authority, the electoral authority is independent, and you elected and selected the electoral authority, and you don't have political parties. You don't have a judiciary or a ministerio público who's going to investigate the crimes. You're not going to get an independent election after that. So what are the recommendations? Of course, at the end, the recommendation is less electoral democracy and more institutions that works and operate to bring democracy in those countries. Told me 10 minutes and it was 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Second, we're going to hear from Salvador Romero, who will be continuing the discussion on these more general and systemic themes and challenges before we turn to Benigno Alarcón, who will speak specifically about the Venezuelan situation.
I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to the seminar, and my presentation will analyze the relationship between democracy, elections, and violence in Latin America in recent decades with a political sociologic approach. The presentation has 5 sections. The first one contains an introduction to the classic link between democracy and violence in Latin America. In the second part, I will analyze the transition between the old and the new violence. The third section studies the new characteristics of violence in election. The fourth part approaches other aspects of political violence, especially the ambiguous or even repressive role of the state. Finally, the presentation analyzes the impact of violence on electoral turnout. Democracy, elections, and violence seem mutually antagonistic and mutually exclusive. Democracy and election presuppose a peaceful environment with institutionalized mechanisms for the dispute of power. They are the expression of a society that channels conflict and antagonism without violence. Conversely, violence, this kind of continuation of political by other means, resolve the control of power with the correlation of forces regardless of institution, law, and citizen consent. The challenge of violence presages crisis or the end of democracy. As we know, the loss of the monopoly of legitimate state violence encourage behaviors of loyalty to the institutions. This antagonistic relationship marks the history of Latin America. First, violence has been often a response to a competitive election with no perspective of peaceful alternation in power. The violence of the perpetuation of the caudillo is responded by the rebellion. For example, the Mexican Revolution starts with the slogan, "Effective suffrage, not re-election." Also, many guerrillas in Central America were justified by electoral frauds. On the other hand, we saw the violence of authoritarian regimes against election, the overthrow of elected authorities, and the suppression of election, like in Chile in the 70s or Cuba today. Finally, the violence against elections in formal or against the formal or bourgeois democracy was done also in name of a new social order, like the attacks from Sendero Luminoso to the first presidential election in Peru in 1980. On the other hand, the exit of the authoritarian regime or violence and the entry into democracy went through a legitimate election, the opening election. It was the Constituent Assembly or presidential race that constitute the inflection point. For example, in Ecuador in 1978, Honduras or Guatemala some years later. Free elections were also a stage of ratification of the peace accords, inclusion of contending actors, and progress towards democracy. And one of the better examples is El Salvador in 1994. In general, the consolidation of democracy and election marked the end of the classical violence, coups, guerrillas, civil wars. As a consequence, a novelty appears in many countries, the first peaceful alternation of power between different parties. Pacification of presidential election is the result of a countable evolution in Latin America. First, the clean and competitive election, despite the fact that citizen trust does not always accompany this evolution. Second, the succession of elections and anticipation of upcoming electoral processes decrease drama from the outcome of an election. The attenuation also of the instrumental vision of election in the whole political spectrum. Four, we have a long and sustained work of citizen education that creates the electoral ritual with attributes of public morality, the civil side, and civilizing elections. And last, the new relationship, less passionate, of citizens with the parties. There are certainly remnants of the old electoral violence, of limited scope and political impact, with the exception of Honduras last year, with a main exception, who is IT. Democracy should have banished violence from politics and turned election into the terrain of peaceful, institutionalized confrontation of legitimate opposition views and the building of the basic consensus of coexistence. 4 decades after the transition to democracy, new forms of violence emerge in electoral arena. With them, new challenges arise. And I will try to view this chiaroscuro of the new relationship with 3 transitions. First, from generalized violence against or from the state in a Manichaean and epic perspective exercised by politicized actors and therefore with a search of legitimacy to a localized presence conducted by non-political actors alien to ideologies and legitimacy interested in the territorial control offered by the elections. Second, from violence against the election to a presence in election with objectives foreign to the political sphere. And third, the transition from violence in presidential election to violence in local or legislative elections. we will try to see the new presence of violence in electoral process. We have the double phase of local elections. They are a key contribution to Latin American democratization, but also the space for new violence. Political decentralization was the spearhead of democratization, but it opened also opportunity to subtract activities from central state control. Local governments tend to be more opaque and authoritarian than those at the national level. They control local institutions and have close link to the economic and social power. Local elections have the greatest potential for violence and conflict, partly because those elections overlap with social or pre- or extra-political dispute. Also, in countries like Guatemala or Peru, local re-election is associated with greater likelihood of violence and conflict. This new violence is exercised by groups without interest in politics, but determined to control the territory for the deployment of their illegal and criminal activities. Those groups use candidates more than party because they are indifferent to ideologies to win throughout violent or intimidating campaigns. They force the resignation or the assassination of rival candidates. They make unequal campaigns and coerce voters to refrain from voting or to vote in their favor. Sometimes candidates and authorities are directly linked to organized crime actors. The payment that they wait is not necessarily economic retribution, but the control of the territory and eventually money laundering with public contracts. Some examples. In Colombia, the paramilitary strategy was to participate and win election with new political parties or under traditional parties, unlike the classic strategy of guerrillas to boycott elections. In Peru, we have the linkage of local power groups engaged in illegal activities, mining, logging, smuggling, with political actors to win regional and municipal elections in a very destructured party system. In Guatemala, Honduras, or Mexico, the drug cartels infiltrate parties to impose candidates that favor cultivation areas or traffic corridors in a selective implantation. That's why the electoral violence is concentrated only in some states in Mexico. The violence poses challenge for central actors of democracy. We have at least 4 actors under threat. First, the electoral management body, who is committed or who has to organize election even where the presence of the state has become fragile. Central American neighborhoods, some Mexican states, and responding by minimum parameters of quality throughout the territory. They must assure campaigns with guarantees for parties and candidates. This electoral management body has also to control the use of economic resources in campaign, to effectively prosecute electoral crimes linked to the violence, and to sanction through electoral justice or other electoral authorities elected in campaigns with violence. For political parties, the difficulty is not being victims or executioners. They must present candidates without risking their lives and having options to succeed cleanly. They have to avoid the cooptation of the sectors of the party by criminal interest. Some solutions are curious. Some years ago, in Tancítaro in Mexico, for example, the 3 main parties chose together just one candidate. They closed the passage to drug traffic at the price of pluralism in the election. Third, the media must be able to carry out their work in electoral times without intimidation, self-censorship, or violence. We have to remember that Latin America is one of the regions with the highest risk for journalists. Finally, electoral observation organizations need conditions to supervise the electoral processes throughout the territory without being intimidated or expelled. In this fourth section, we will analyze other phases of violence, in particular, authoritarian practices driven or tolerated by the government. They give an ambiguous role to the state. They distance it from its role as guarantor of rights and freedom and as the antidote to violence. These renewed phases of violence wrapped up in legal forms include imprisonment or disqualification of opposition leaders, pressures on independent medias, biased electoral decisions in favor of the government. And the saddest example are Venezuela and Nicaragua. Furthermore, there is a pressure on nuclei of the electoral from the government through social programs, for example, crossing lists of participation in elections and beneficiaries of social programs or public employees. The conditions of the vote lend themselves to the exercise of old or new form of violence against vulnerable sectors of the population in some regions. Jean-Jacques Rousseau phrases is current in Latin America that no citizen is so opulent to be able to buy another and none one poor enough to be forced to sell himself. There is coercion and intimidation of voters due to relations of socio-political dominance and aggressive clientelism of the part of some political actors or even of the state control. And political gender violence is a new phenomenon on an old social found. Today, women have access to numerous spaces of power. In fact, today Latin America is the second region in the world by the number of parliamentarian women. This empowerment provokes machismo reactions with many pressures for women to resign their positions. I will analyze now the impact of violence on political and electoral turnout. Violence impacts electoral process and affects political participation. The correlation between electoral turnout and the homicide rate at the subnational level in Latin America is minus 25.6. The correlation is accentuated in Mexico and Central America, where violence has had an accelerated growth in recent years. In Central America, political violence has disappeared or has been attenuated, but that of criminal origin emerges as a generalized phenomenon. The correlation is less important in South America, where the rates of violence remain lower, particularly in the southern cone, and does not seem to have such a direct impact on turnout. The following two maps offer the overall perspective. You have, in the right, the homicide rates, and in the left, the turnout turnout in elections. And you can see the most violent region are the region who has the least turnout participation. Areas penalized by violence are more likely to abstain in elections. Social life is torn, and foundation of participation in collective life are damaged. Even when the violence is overcome, For example, the violence zone of Sendero Luminoso in Peru remain the least participatory. People in these areas seek to reduce risk. They withdraw to the private sphere, leave public spaces, distrust strangers, and become angry with the state. These attitudes have a negative impact on the willingness to participate. The Central American ordinary crime still does not influence the electoral processes, but there are signs of change. In Honduras, there are allegations of intimidation against participation, and in El Salvador, some reports affirm the presence of people linked to the gangs in the municipal level. Some conclusions. The challenge to democracy. Violence in Latin America does not pose the dilemma of the past, democracy versus authoritarianism, election versus civil wars, electoral process versus coups. In the democratic framework, a new violence, very different from the previous one, is implanted. It uses and distorts the emblematic mechanisms of democracy, the elections, to develop its activity. The result is not the disappearance of democracy, but the impoverishment of its content. Authoritarian regional enclaves appear in a democratic national system. Actors emerge who move in the gray area of norm and practices. Which is the profile of the new violence in the elections? One, rural areas with weak state presence, peripheral to the center of political and economic power, but strategic for criminal activities. Two, instrumental use of election by non-political actors interested in territorial control, especially in local and possibly congressional elections. Three, violence is exercised earlier than during the election day, in which only its effects and results are monitored. 4. The electoral turnout decreases. 5. The regionalized and partial nature of violence generates ordinary little attention from the state and political actor. And 6. Due to its characteristics, there are low probability of extension of this kind of violence in Latin America. And finally, the challenge is to control the threats with the instrument of democracy and rule of law throughout the territory. We need to improve political founding rules and regulate electoral campaigns. We need to improve the prosecution of crimes and the justice system to reduce levels of impunity. We need to improve the accountability and transparency in the exercise of government, especially at the local level. We need to offer guarantees for candidates and elected authority in territories under threat by organized crime. In summary, the agenda for the elimination of new forms of violence in electoral process is the agenda for improving the quality of Latin American democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvador. And now we hear from Benigno Alarcón to bring this all home to the Venezuelan experience.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the Clough Center and especially Daniela Urosa for getting us together in this wonderful conference to have the opportunity to learn for each other. First, I think that democracy is in hard times. I think it's not a secret for anybody. And today, more than 50% of the world is governed for governments that are not democracies. That is Venezuela, as you already know, is in a very bad position right now. In 2012, when Chavez was alive, according to the index on the Economist, the magazine, Venezuela was classified as a hybrid regime, and it was a hybrid regime for many, many years. But in 2013, after Chavez's death, Venezuela jumped from the position 95 to the position 97. And from the beginning of the government of Nicolás Maduro in 2013 to 2017, Venezuela moved from the position 97 to the position 117. And today is classified as authoritarian regime. But Venezuela is not the exception. If you see the world in 2010, we can see that the Americas were blue, were electoral democracies or full democracies. But today, the Americas and part of the world are becoming less blue and more orange and red. Okay? What is going on in Venezuela? This story is not fiction. Began with Chavez, as soon as Chavez arrived. In 1999, the Venezuelan political system was gradually transformed from an electoral democracy into a hybrid regime. The changes in the political processes began with the approval of a new constitution at the end of 1999. During his campaign, Chavez promised to abolish the constitution of 1961 and write a new one. In 1999, Venezuelans voted in a referendum to decide whether or not they wanted to call for a national constituency assembly. Once the creation of the constituency assembly was approved, people were called to elect its members. After 6 months of deliberation, the constituency assembly, citizens were called once again to cast their votes in order to approve or refuse the new constitution. On December 15, the new constitution was approved by 72% of voters in a referendum with a turnaround of 45%. After Hugo Chavez was elected, there has been at least 25 elections, if my counting is okay, including the presidential of this year. However, this election has served the purpose of strengthening a non-democratic governance. During Chavez's presidency, the Venezuelan political system was transformed into a hybrid regime. Oh, sorry. I have a problem with your mouse. Don't worry. Okay. Into a hybrid regime, more accurately into a competitive authoritarian regime. Okay. Okay, Chavez learned the advantage of a hybrid regime playing at the electoral arena by using and abusing, whoops. Sorry. Okay. Chavez learned the advantage of a hybrid regime. Wow, it's amazing. Sorry. Okay, Chavez very early in this, after was elected, learned the advantage of transform the system in a hybrid regime. So immediately after the approval of the constitution, of the new constitution, he called for a new election to elect all the authorities in the country. Okay, take it with the advantage of the bandwagon effect. And he used the timing and sequencing of elections to take control of all the institutions in Venezuela and the regional and local governments at that time. Chavez, during his 13 years in power, held and won more elections than any other previous government, progressively occupying with his allies almost every single state position, also manipulating the electoral timing of subnational elections in order to guarantee the control of the main strongholds in the states and municipalities. Okay, this story continues with Maduro. These electoral practices have been deepened during the term of Nicolás Maduro at the beginning of his government in 2013. The timing and sequencing of elections have been used to reinforce the concentration of power by the ruling party, as the Electoral National Council wrangles the timing of election to favor the winning odds of the ruling party. In this sense, we have that on March 5th, Nicolás Maduro announced that Hugo Chavez has passed away, and a new presidential election took place in 40 days after his death. As a consequence of this unrealistic deadline to organize a presidential election, the electoral campaign was very short, giving Maduro, as the incumbent, an advantage to guarantee his victory. However, this advantage was not enough. Nicolás Maduro almost lost the election, inasmuch as the difference with the candidate of the opposition was less than 1.5% of the votes. 2 years later, in the legislative election on December 16, 2015, the government lost control of the legislative branch when the opposition gained 2/3 of the seats in the National Assembly. On December 29th, the Electoral Chamber of the Supreme Court, alleging vote buying, sentenced the suspension of the representative of 4 elected representatives. This means the invalidation of the electoral result, which implied the losses of 2/3 majority obtained by the opposition. Although we have one state without legislative representation, the Electoral Council systematically avoid to call for a new election. The governor's election should have been held on December 2016, but they were postponed for 1 year in order to avoid a bandwagon effect that could have favored the opposition parties after the parliamentary election. On October 2016, the Electoral Authority announced that this election was to be held on December 17, 1 year after. However, after the inauguration of the new Constituency Assembly, the actual one, on August 2017, this entity decreed the governor's election must be held on October 2017, 2 months before that the day scheduled by the National Electoral Council. In the case of the presidential recall referendum during 2016, not only the National Electoral Council imposed new requisites and rules not contemplated in the current legislation, but also took more days than the ones stated in the law to respond to the petition of the opposition. Then a process that should have been last 213 days suffered a delay of more than 80 days, even though the opposition managed to overcome all the requisites added by the National Electoral Council, but at the end, several courts at regional level prevent the presidential recall referendum, their presidential recall referendum. On October 2016, by banning the collection of the 20% signatures for calling the recall. On May 2017, the president decided to go ahead with the election of members of the new National Constituency Assembly. Despite the Constitution of 1999 is binding about the need for a referendum in order to call a National Constituency Assembly, the executive branch called the election of the members of the Asamblea Nacional Constituyente without consulting the people whether they wanted to have a new constitution or not. Not only the Constituency Assembly election was unconstitutional, but also the rules to elect the National Assembly, National Constituency Assembly members violated the principle of one person, one vote. The president stated that the National Assembly had to be elected by municipality and sectors or corporations. Hence, each municipality, irrespective of its population, elected one member of the National Assembly by a plurality of votes, except for large cities in which voters elected two. Additionally, the government decided that 176 members had to be elected by 8 corporations defined by the government itself, such as farmers and fishers, students, workers, people with disabilities, businessmen, indigenous communities, pension, and members of communities. At the end of this election was rigged, and the turnout percentage wrangled by the Electoral Authority. The result is a one-party National Assembly, the one that we have today, with unlimited and supra-constitutional powers. But what is the explanation for this kind of performance in the government? One thing that I discovered in one book some years ago, in the book edited by Stefan Limber, is the difference in stability between the hybrid regimes and the authoritarian regimes. And if you, as you can see here, you have that full democracies or liberal democracies are very stable, and most of them, 100% of them, continue being democracies election after election between 1995 and 2006. There's a difference between in the electoral democracies where some of them were able to improve, but other ones were, walking on the opposite direction, becoming authoritarian or hybrid regimes. The problem with hybrid regimes is that they are not the most stable kind of regimes. So 50%, around 50%, were able to stay in power between these years, but 33%, the green column, became democracies because the government lost an election and they were able to change the regime. But some of them became an authoritarian regime. And if you compare the authoritarian regime with the hybrid regimes, you can see the authoritarian regimes, more than 70% of them were able to stay in power for during those years. So I suspect that the government discovered that being an authoritarian regime can give them the stability to stay in power for more time. Finally, I want to show you, and I want to, to beg your pardon because I didn't translate this table. but I want to show you a table of scenarios that we have worked at the Center of Political Studies in order to understand what is going on and what are the possibilities of the scenarios, okay? So first, at the horizontal axis, we have the main actors in this game, okay? International community, the government and their its allies, and the opposition.
Can you use the microphone, maybe?
Yes, of course, sorry. So, the important thing about these actors, about the international community, is what is the position of international community between trying to push for democracy in Venezuela or being moderate and looking for stability in the country. Okay, that makes a difference in our scenarios. In the case of the government and the opposition, the difference is how united or how divided they are. Okay, so these scenarios are producing a first group of scenarios in red color. Okay, what the red color means autocratization. Okay, red color means that the government, with those circumstances, is able to advance in its own autocratization. According to this, if the government is united, the opposition is divided, okay, and we have a low level of mobilization to push to ask for elections and for democracy, the government is in its best position to advance in the autocratization effort. That is the scenarios that we are watching today or looking today. Okay. Obviously, in those cases where you have some kind of mobilization and social pressure for democracy, the government has a good opportunity to advance in autocratization if they stay united, as we can see the last year. The second group of scenarios in green color are scenarios under the control of the military. Okay? Those scenarios are becoming more possible in the case that the government becomes divided. Okay? Why? Because the cost of being out of power for the military is very, very high. We know very well that today there are sanctions against military leaders because of human rights or because illegal businesses or because some other issues. So in this case, if the government is divided, the possibility of the military taking or trying to take control of the situation is very, very high. It has a very high probability. Okay, something similar to Zimbabwe, for example, after what happened with Mugabe. No. A third kind of scenarios are in yellow and blue, okay? Those are transition scenarios, okay? In the case of the yellow color, we are talking about scenarios where the transition is possible only by negotiation with the military sector, okay? The blue ones are a normal transition where a new government is able to control the government without the interference or any actor from the previous administration or from the previous government, okay? For these scenarios to happen, we need the factors that made this scenario more probable has to be with the a degree of mobilization and pressure inside the country, the possibilities to build some kind of agreement with the military sector and other actors, and is always or almost always necessary the opposition to be united for these scenarios to work. Okay? If you see the whole table, it's very interesting because one conclusion is that you can see that most of the color has to be with a government under the country under the control of the actual government or under the control of the military. Okay, the transition scenarios are not abundant in this case, and the traditional transition, the blue ones, are only 3 scenarios in this table. Okay, where are we today? Today we are in these corners. I'm almost finished. We are in the scenario 4 or 20, depending if you consider that the international community is pushing for democracy or is moderating their position to look for stability. This is a very convenient position for the government because, as you can see, they are far from the transition scenarios, and although some people say, okay, it's an equilibrium, a very precarious equilibrium, I like to explain that equilibrium like that, okay? The pen is in a very precarious equilibrium. But if you don't move the table, the pen can be there in that position for 100 years without any problem. So the problem is that the equilibrium is precarious. But if nothing happens, it's an equilibrium, okay? And the equilibrium will be stable as long as nothing else happens, okay? So that is very important. The only way to move for the opposition is to build the capacity to mobilize the country, to push for democracy, to be united, and to be able to divide the government because of those actions or something else, okay? That is our projection of scenarios. It's not exactly about the electoral process in Venezuela, but I think that this could be interesting for this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So I would ask you to use one of the microphones, please. Who would like to begin?
Thank you for a fascinating, absolutely fascinating panel. I have many questions, so let me ask a few of them, but quickly. I'll ask about 3. The first one goes to the relation between the first talk and the last one, the Venezuela case, and on sort of the suggestion, I guess, in the first talk that when it comes to authoritarian systems, we would be better off not organizing elections altogether. And we have the Venezuela case where, you know, by your count, there have been 20 plus elections. So I just wonder if you would like to comment on that. You know, would it have been better for Venezuela not to have elections, to just drop that? Because on the one hand, of course, it legitimizes the autocrats. At the same time, it just keeps some level of form that preserves this idea of democracy and self-government. The second question goes, again on the Venezuela case, to if you could say a little bit more about the role of the military, which of course has been interestingly absent from many of the conversations, but it's very much significant for what's going on. And I understand that there are ways in which the Maduro and the Chavez regimes have been sort of, you know, co-opting the military. But at the same time, it seems that if the country implodes entirely, as it seems to be the case with Venezuela now, if the economy is entirely collapsing, if the health system is entirely collapsing, so the social texture is collapsing entirely, that might impact the military's own sense of self-preservation. And are we at that tipping point? And if we are, which way will the military go? Will it turn against the regime? And finally, on the incredibly interesting talk about violence and elections generally, and going to your slides about homicides rates and rates of political participation, I wonder if it would be possible to slice this a little bit more thinly and look at cases of where homicides are prosecuted. And because we know that, for example, in the United States, about half of the homicides are not prosecuted. So if you're interested, so would there be any kind of correlation about how the state solves the problem of, each of the homicide, and the overall rate, and then the rate of election turnout?
So let's go ahead and take those 3 questions now, and then we'll open it back up for additional questions. Yes. Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also thought that the panel was fascinating. Thank you very much. In relation, Salvador, in relation to this issue of comparing these 2 graphs, first it's a comparison. It's not, you just put them there, there's no correlation analysis. However, if you see both maps, you can see some situations that contradict your assertions, because in the case of Chile, there's a very low rate of homicide and a very low rate of participation. In the case of Venezuela, there's a very high rate of homicides and a very high rate of participation. So those cases don't fit into that model. So I think maybe the kind of violence indicators that is better suited for electoral participation may be different, or maybe, the relationship may be complex enough as to need to find, like different indicators and different, and associate them in a different way, maybe.
Okay, thank you. So, panel, who wants to begin?
I just gonna comment about the situation of no election or election. Chavez based his international support in oil for some countries, but also selling the image of a Democrat. For several years, Chavez organized different elections because he was sure that he can manipulate with populists and also controlling the institution. He controlled the electoral authority, he controlled also the judiciary, so he had the full control of the whole cycle. And in that sense, organizing an election in Venezuela didn't make a lot of change in terms of the structure of the regime. My current approach in some countries, including Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba, the countries where I work directly in those countries, is strengthening social movement, creating a kind of network of a social movement internally so they can have the control over the territory and create enough pressure against the regimes for the regimes make mistakes or force the regime to go to some kind of negotiation or force the regime to bring an alternative to the table. Without that, not the international pressure alone, not elections, gonna make any change in this country. And I believe that the same applies for Venezuela. Organizing elections in Venezuela is not gonna change. The regime can control the whole electoral process. We saw that last year with the election, this year with the election of the National Constitutional Assembly, or the election of Maduro, or the last election that the regime controls everything. Those are not elections and not going to change the opportunity of those countries to move forward.
Benigno, would you like to?
Okay, regarding the elections and authoritarian regimes, although Carlos doesn't agree with me about hybrid regimes and authoritarian regimes, in my opinion, there's a clear difference, okay? Like both of them looks like a horse, but one is a horse and the other is a zebra, no? And the problem with hybrid regimes is that they need a base to be, to operate by celebrating elections. In the case of the authoritarian regimes, that base is already disappearing, so they need to change the way that they are operating. And that's the case in Venezuela. With Chavez alive, was very easy to win elections year after year. After Chavez disappeared, and some of the resources, the economic resources, disappeared almost at the same time, the name of the game changed, because they don't have the charismatic leadership of Chavez, but on the other hand, they didn't have any more the resources to support the clientelism system that they create with the participation of millions of people who were around the government to receive some kind of favors, money, and some kind of support. So this is a totally different case. And in my opinion, elections at the time that this political base is disappearing, elections are less important. For Chavez, elections were very important to support his government and to be able to do the things that he did. But right now, elections are, in a totally different position, and that's the reason because they are playing a totally different kind of game at this time. I want to be totally clear about, I totally agree with Carlos that a hybrid regime is not a democracy with problems. A hybrid regime is an authoritarian regime. There's no doubt about that. But authoritarian regimes with different kind of functioning models, no? On the other hand, about the military, that is, for me, a key question. Where exactly is the tipping point for the military? At the time that the government or the base of support of the government, the electoral base of support of the government is shrinking, the capacity to stay in power depends on less people, okay? And those people are the people who has the weapons and who has the power to support the government in power, okay? So the cooptation of the military in this case is very, very important. So what we can see in the case of Venezuela, rewards and punishment among the military people are extraordinarily high today, okay? If you are not supporting the government, you will be in jail or you will be killed, okay? But if you are supporting the government, you can be a rich man in a very, very short time. So if you are somebody who is a colonel and next year will be a general, the expectation is that you will be rich in the next 2 or 3 years, okay? So you are in the lane waiting for your time to be rich, okay? So the problem is that it's very difficult to have the people at the high level of the military going against the government because the rewards are extremely high, are amazingly high, okay? If you are in Táchira, for example, the state that is in the border with between Venezuela and in Venezuela in the border with Colombia, okay? All the gas smuggling is controlled by the military, okay? It's controlled by the military. And you can see a clear difference. If you have a colonel at the border, the colonel almost all of the time, it can be some exceptions with if the colonel have some problems with the superiority with their supervisors. But if the colonel is in a good position with the government, he can be there for a long, long time. But most of the people who are supporting the effort at the border and are soldiers, troops, most of them, they are deserting and going to Colombia because they are not receiving anything for that distribution of money. So there's a clear difference between the high level and the low level, okay? The problem is, what could you do with the low level? And one of the things that I believe can create that tipping point is the day that the high level has doubts about what will be the performance of the low level if you have a country that is very mobilized and you have an important percentage of people participating in protests in the country, because the high level depends on the troops. And if the troops are not willing to repress people, the government will be in problems. And that was the same case in Eastern Europe and in other places. So that could be the tipping point that you were talking about.
Thank you. Benigno, Salvador, would you go ahead and respond?
Yes. Thank you. In the country where we have this violence accelerate growth in recent years, normally is the sign of a very weak state. And so you have a very high homicide rate, but also a very high impunity rate. For example, in some countries of Central America, the rate of impunity can be 95%. So it's very, very high. You will do an assassination and you won't be punished, not punished by the judiciary branch. Certainly you will have a punishment, but it will be an extra judiciary branch punishment. No? You have a very high likelihood to be killed by another gang or in another criminal situation. No? So both the homicide rate and the impunity rate in those countries are very linked, and both are very high. No? And the objective of this research and of this presentation was to say that we have to pay attention to the impact of violence in turnout, and we have important correlations between those two factors, the electoral turnout and the homicide rate. Of course, it's a correlation, and you will have some cases that you will have a high rate of homicide and high rate of turnout also. But the general correlation is true, and it's important to pay attention to the impact of violence in political participation and in electoral turnout. In general, we don't pay the importance that this factor has in political participation and in electoral turnout. No? Even if we have, of course, countries who does exception to this correlation.
All right, we'll collect a few questions from the audience now and then give the panel a chance to respond. Please, in the back.
My question has to do with...
Oh, can you wait till we get a microphone to you? Is there one out there somewhere? Thank you.
Thank you. My question has to do with international election monitoring programs. And what you've described, I think each of you has done an excellent job in highlighting the fact that elections are not, shouldn't be equated with increasing democracy. Instead, elections in many, many instances are being used to consolidate power by authoritarian regimes. So as much as positive intent comes to mind when you think about international election monitoring programs, are they aiding and assisting authoritarians in maintaining their power and gaining legitimacy on the world stage with international businesses and other governments? Or are they really doing a proper job and calling out the problems with local election interference. They have an unenviable task, and I'm curious on A, what your thoughts are, and what maybe the some cures would be going forward.
Thank you. Other questions? I think there's... All right, then I'll exercise the chair's prerogative and throw a question in as well here at the end, which is, and I apologize if this has already been raised earlier in the conference, but I can't help but think of these questions against the backdrop of the current political situation in the United States in this particular way, in that it strikes me that certainly the panelists that I've been hearing, and I'm sure many others of you, are no strangers to having to maintain a positive perspective and work over many, many, many years to see incremental gains in recreating a democratic culture or a democratic conversation. Whereas here in Massachusetts, I find among many of my friends, it's very easy to succumb to the privilege of despair and hopelessness and what are we going to do, et cetera, et cetera. So it strikes me that if you have something to teach us about how to keep a long and progressive and positive perspective on something that is a decade-long challenge, it would be a good time for us to learn that from you. So I would open you to respond.
Maybe I have to begin with the end. Sadly, the U.S. has been going down in our report every year. It's not new with President Trump. With President Obama also, we saw that the U.S. Was going in the wrong direction. Gerrymandering, some abuses with decree, governing by decree, so some things. But since the last campaign and during the last year, probably our report is going to show that the U.S. is going to enter in partially free. That's going to create a major problem for us as an organization, but last year we were almost there. Almost there. I think that we missed the partially free by 3-4 points. And I think that we crossed that line this year, and probably your report's going to show, I don't know yet, but probably is what we're going to have. And that is a problem because we see that the U.S. is moving. It has the envy about the disaster in the rest of Latin America and the region. The U.S. has been moving that way, persecuting journalists, limiting the power of the people, controlling the electoral areas for the U.S. So it is a problem to see that the U.S., instead of improving, is going backward. And U.S. going backward also create an additional problem for the region because authoritarians now have a free ride to persecute journalists. For example, in Guatemala. In Guatemala, the clown of Guatemala decided to persecute journalists, to persecute human rights defenders, and the U.S., instead of saying anything about that, to the contrary. In the morning, I was there in Guatemala. In the morning, I had a meeting with the ambassador, and the ambassador publicly said, President Morales, you cannot use USA big vehicles and USA things to persecute journalists. So please do not use that, and we do not support this kind of behavior. That was in the morning, the U.S. ambassador. By noontime, the Secretary of State gave a press conference saying that the U.S. fully supports the government of Guatemala, fully support the activities of the government of Guatemala, and that they are not sending any message to President Morales. So that kind of message, of course, allow President Morales to continue on going against the Constitutional Court, going against the CICIG, and he has a free ride. Same applies with Honduras. Honduras, the U.S. message to Honduras is, do whatever you want. You need to control the migrants, but the rest, do whatever you want in Honduras. It has been the message from the U.S. So instead of having a message from the U.S., our concern is that the U.S. is sending an additional message for all these autocrats to have a free ride in terms of whatever they want to do in each one of these countries. So that's for the second one. And but for the first one, I don't believe that any observation is good. So when you have a lot, and sorry for the OAS, and I care for the OAS, and I really am a friend of Almagro, but a last minute observation that goes to a country 1 week before the election is not an electoral observation. They'll go there just to see the last mile, when they already made fraud in terms of organizing the election, where they already manipulate the padrón electoral, the electoral register of the voters, when they already did everything. So you go there and just observe the election as it is, the day of the election. But that day is too late. And when is a good time for an observation? Maybe several months before that, but it's too expensive. Then nobody do that kind of job. So going there, I have been participating in several electoral observation processes. What you do there is to validate sometimes the fraud, because everything is done by that time.
I don't know if I have any kind of answer for the last questions, but I would like to share a final reflection in this panel. And I think that democracy is still today the regime with more legitimacy, without any doubt, okay? I think that almost everybody around the world wants to live in democracy. And I think the problem with democracy is that democracy is falling apart in its functioning because its capabilities, not because of democracy by itself, okay? So the problem here is how to build strong institutions, how to build capabilities in the government in order to avoid those people who are taking advantage of the weaknesses to gain elections by using populism and to destroy the democratic systems around the world, okay? And that is a big issue. I think that that is an issue that explains how democracy, how happened the death of democracy in Venezuela after 50 years. And that is the question that for me, and I want to be very respectful about this opinion, put the United States in a similar risk, no? So I think that it's extremely important how to build strong institutions and capabilities in order to avoid this kind of populism trying to take advantage of the weaknesses of the system. I think that that is extremely important. On the other hand, I think that part of this task begin with the voters, begin with the people, okay? With people's education. The problem is that if people are believing promises that are not possible, they are, cooperating with this kind of processes that at the end are destroying all the democratic systems. So I think that part of Latin America is in the middle of this situation. I think the United States could be going toward this kind of phenomenon. And we can see part of Europe right now going toward that direction. So I think that, I don't know if it's an answer, but, it's my concern at least.
Thank you. I will try to answer the first question. Democracy and elections are not perfect synonyms, but there is a clear link between the quality of the election and the quality of democracy. And you don't have any bad democracy who organize good elections, and good elections in the both sides. In technical aspects, it may be correct, but you will certainly not have the other conditions that are necessary for a good election. That is the freedom of association, the freedom of speech, the possibility for all the political spectrum to participate in elections. So there is a link, an important link between the quality of the elections and the quality of democracy.
Well, please join me in thanking this panel for an extremely rich and interesting conversation.